Salutations to the Truth Core, whoever and wherever you may be on the planet. This is once again John Lash, founder of Nemeta, the Sophianic School of Arts and Sciences. And I'm here with installment number 9 in Mythology 101. The title is The Power of Narrative. I took a little breather there. I don't mean to break the pace of these talks. I do have quite a lot going right now, so producing these talks is not the only thing that I'm doing, nor is it my priority. Nonetheless, you have my word that I will make my best effort to polish off this course in the remaining 3 talks. Of course, it could be said that you might as well have needed a small break after talk number 8 on the slave species meme. I can assure you that the material compressed in that talk belongs to the top level of investigation in creative and comparative mythology. By the way, sometimes I say creative mythology. That's the title of a book by Joseph Campbell. It's a program that he introduced, but he did not implement. Comparative mythology is the more accurate term for the genre in which I work. And it could be said of this series of 12 talks that it represents or presents or offers to you a crash course in comparative mythology. In tackling the slave species meme, I had occasion to look at the distinction between certain terms in Sumerian myth and Semitic myth, as well as terms in the Gnostic materials of the Greek Coptic books from Nag Hammadi, and with some allusion to other ancient materials such as the Book of Enoch. And truth be told, it's one hell of a task to sort out who's who and what's what, and who's doing what to who in these ancient texts. The distinction between the Orion men, who belong to the human species and who descended from the Orion Nebula M42 and dropped into the earth, and the Anunnaki, supposedly pictured as extraterrestrials who are thought to have invaded the earth, that distinction is, needless to say, extremely important and rather difficult to develop and argue in a clear and consistent way. But I did the best that I could within the limits of that talk. There was a considerable amount of technical terminology in that talk, and understandably, you might not at first sight or at first listen be able to retain it or incorporate it. Perhaps the outstanding point to bear in mind is that the Nephilim were the giants of antiquity, and the Nephilim were the Orion men. The word Nephilim is related to the Greek word nephelis, which means cloud. So I also call them the cloud men. And they are to be distinguished from the archons. You can equate them to the watchers from the book of Enoch. But that correlation is problematical and ambiguous, because in fact, the archons are the true watchers, The Archons, this extraterrestrial cyborg species, has been watching and surveilling the human species on Earth for untold hundreds of thousands of years. So you see how difficult it is to clarify these terms and these actors in the great cosmic drama in which we are involved. Now, it's inevitable that any discussion in this area, or even any daydreaming or wondering about what's going on in the vast cosmic scenarios of prehistory, it's inevitable that the theme of the fallen angels comes up. The theme of Lucifer and the Luciferians and the fallen angels. And this is yet again another file which is corrupt and confused. Now, I dedicated 3 talks to that subject sometime, about 3 years ago actually, entitled "The True Lucifer is Sophia." I wouldn't even begin to try to give you one sentence from the argument I made at that time. I'm just bringing it up to point out that there are so many difficult elements to straighten out and sort out when we look in the direction of not just ancient history, but the prehistory of our species, in order to see what events occurred then which have a cumulative effect upon life in the world today. But this is indeed one of the tasks, and in my view, one of the responsibilities of a comparative mythologist, to bring it all home and show how it's relevant right here and right now. And I wish by the end of this series that I am able to accomplish that objective. In a full and adequate exposition of some of the issues that I tackled in talk number 8, you would have to include the corroborating or supporting material for my outrageous claim that men who belong to the rifted part of the anthropic genome and who were, as it were, stranded and separated from their sexual counterparts, how they came from the Orion Nebula and managed to descend upon the Earth and arrive within the atmosphere of the Earth. Needless to say, that's a pretty outrageous claim. But there is supporting material. So before I go on to the main topic of this talk, which is the power of the narrative, let me just give you one example. This comes from the text that goes with my 3 talks entitled "The True Lucifer is Sophia." Quote, "In Tibetan lore derived from indigenous Bompo shamanism in the Himalayas, the expression opening the door of the sky designates ascent into the celestial sphere by means of a magical rainbow light cord. DMU, Dmu. The Dmu cord is the symbol of communication between earth and sky. This word is also found in divinatory rites, in which it connotes, quote, the cord for ascending to the sky, end quote. According to ancient narratives, the Dmu cord was used by the early kings to descend to earth and then reascend to heaven after their death, end quote. Now, that's not me. That is from a book called Tantra in Practice. And it is a quotation from scholars, historical scholars of Tantric Buddhism. And I could cite other examples as well. The Kahuna shamans of Polynesia, which is about as far away from the plateau of Tibet as you can get on this planet, also talk extensively about a cord, which they call the Aka cord. And according to them, the shaman is able to teleport here and there around the cosmos using the Aka cord. Now, another allusion to this cord can be found in the material of theosophy that came to the world through Madame Blavatsky and others at the end of the 19th century during what can be called the occult revival of that time. There were books written at that time about the double and as well about the astral double, the doppelganger, and these books, some of these books, give accounts of first-hand experiences which can be called paranormal experiences, non-ordinary experiences, in which people found themselves traveling out of the body spontaneously. And it was observed or stated in these reports that there was a filament called the silver cord that connected them to their body, their physical body, while they were out of the body, teleporting here or there. That is further corroboration. And finally, if you want to go into the Egyptian materials, which are very dense and deeply, shall I say, deeply encoded, well, you can find certain references to the Ka, which is the double, and some of those references also refer to a cord. As a matter of fact, the Pharaoh wore on his ceremonial attire an umbilical cord. And the name of that cord was very odd. It was called Kamatsu, meaning the bull of his mother. And in some mysterious fashion, that cord, the pharaohs wore a skirt, and the cord hung down from the skirt. In some mysterious fashion, that cord represented a power that the pharaoh had to move between dimensions or to move into the unknown, into the Nahwal, into the supernatural, and return. It's also said that that cord was actually the umbilical cord of the newborn Pharaoh, which had been preserved and given to him to wear as ceremonial attire. So you see, these matters are deep and intricate. And one of the great pleasures of being a comparative mythologist is, of course, to investigate them. But remember what I said. All the clues in the world don't count if you don't know what crime has been committed. So you will come across many symbols, many images, many strange terms in comparative mythology, but you won't be able to make out what they mean unless you have an idea and a question that you bring to the investigation. I think I've demonstrated that method for you pretty clearly so far. So, moving on. I'm looking here at the notes in the unit in Nemeta, which corresponds to this series of talks. And in the notes to the talk on the Gnostic warning, I've drawn the parallels between the Hebrew file and the Gnostic file, which contains the master narrative of the fallen goddess scenario and other intel coming from the mysteries. Once again, I emphasize that these two bodies of material refer intentionally and specifically to each other. You cannot say that when comparing other mythologies. For instance, it's well known that Hermes in Greek mythology is in some sense an equivalent, or better said, a correlate to Thoth or Tahuti in Egyptian mythology. But nevertheless, you don't find text in Egyptian mythology, hieroglyphic texts, that refer directly to the Greek figure of Hermes. On the other hand, you do find certain Greek texts that refer to the Egyptian mysteries, because many Greek sages and truth seekers, like Pythagoras, went to Egypt to be instructed. So some Greek texts will refer to the equivalence in Egyptian religion of certain Greek gods, but it's only a loose parallel. By contrast, what you see with these two different files, the Hebrew and the Gnostic, is actually a deadlock. You see an adversarial situation. So the Dead Sea Scrolls name the Gnostics as the children of Seir, and they name them as their primary enemy, as I pointed out in Not in His Image. The War Scroll has a hit list, and at the top of the hit list was the children of Seth, those who came from the sacred white mountain of Seir, which is in the Caucasus. And they are the arch enemies of those who wrote the Hebrew file. And the name that you can put on them, by the way, is the Zaddikim. Zaddikim, from the word Zaddik, which is a Hebrew word meaning righteous, holier than thou. So on this page, on Nemeta, I've illustrated these parallels, and you can go and look at it and refresh your memory anytime you like. For instance, Enoshut, which is the Hebrew word for humanity, but which, as I've noted, is concealed in the Old Testament, not openly used. There's a lie in the name Adam. The Goyim who read this Hebrew file identify Adam as their primal parent. But that is not at all the case. It's a deceit. A deceit in the first page of the document. So, Enoshut is the Hebrew word equivalent to anthropos in the Gnostic writings. Instead of Adam and Eve as our primal parents, the Gnostics taught that our primal parents are divine aeons who inhabit the core of the galaxy, or that is their home base. And so Thelete and Sophia are our divine parents. Now, in considering these parallels, I just want to point out one key element to you. The purpose of this talk is not to encumber or immerse you in technicalities, but one key element has paramount importance. The Gnostic material defines Yahweh, Jehovah, El Elyon, the supreme creator God of the Hebrew, as El Dabaoth. And El Dabaoth, according to the Gnostics, is a vicious, demented, extraterrestrial entity. That is the Gnostic warning. Consistent with that identification, who are the archons? Just asking for a friend. Well, they happen to be the horde or swarm of ETs who are in the command of the archon overlord, El Dabaoth. You see? Well, that comparison, that identification, which is absolutely outrageous and heretical, I think you're getting the drift. That identification begs the question, Well, if the Gnostics had a name to identify the Archon Overlord and his legion, did the Hebrew have a name in their own texts to identify the Archons? As far as I know, the Greek word Archon doesn't appear in the Hebrew file. As far as I know, it doesn't appear except as translated into Elohim. So, they identified the Archons as Elohim, and that's as close as you get. There's no other word that I have ever found in the Hebrew material that more closely resembles or identifies Archon. Of course, it doesn't resemble it, but it identifies the Archons. So you have Elohim, Archons. But it's amusing to point out something else, which I discussed at length in Not in His Image. One of the main texts, the original source materials in the Hebrew file, is the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly in a series called the Thanksgiving Hymns, you find that the cult of the Dead Sea, Qumran, which is on the Dead Sea, overlooking the Dead Sea near Jerusalem, the members of that cult, who were Tzaddikim, identified extraterrestrial saviors. So they did not merely identify the Elohim in the beginning of their creation story in Genesis, but they also identified them in another way in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what did the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls call the Elohim? They called them the Kenoshim. And they described them as flying in the sky in shining circular chariots. That is a fact. You can go and read the source materials. I quote them in Not in His Image. I concluded from that the cult of the Dead Sea, which was one outpost of the Tzaddikim, the radical Hebrew ideologues, but not the only one, that the Dead Sea sect was, in fact, a flying saucer cult, similar to those known in our times. And I got to know one of them really well, because years ago in Santa Fe, I had a close friend whose name was Maggie. She was from Washington State. And Maggie disappeared in Los Angeles, California, not long after I arrived there. And no one heard about her for 20 years until her name turned up in a newspaper article about the Heaven's Gate cult, which was a suicide cult. She had been abducted into that cult, and she committed suicide along with 50 or 60 of the other members. So it might seem really strange. It might seem rather far-fetched. However, I assure you that there exists in the world today a UFO religion associated with an enormous cult known all around the world. And what is that cult? This time I'm not asking for a friend. I'm just asking you. Did you know that it is the Nation of Islam? That is a fact. Now there is a book, you can go research it. It's called The Children of Ezekiel. And it is a solid scholarly book based on historical evidence and based on extensive first-hand records of the formation of the Nation of Islam, which is headed by Louis Farrakhan. And it shows on the testimony of the founder and leaders of that cult that it is a flying saucer cult. I kid you not. So you see, such as exists today also existed in ancient times. And of course, it follows that there is a strong association and overlapping between ET UFO mythology and the religious mythology of the Hebrew file. And I've analyzed and deconstructed that in Not in His Image. So, having bewitched and beguiled you with all of those matters, let me proceed to the main point of this talk, which concerns the power of narrative. Now, I'm going to use an analogy that I often use, and I like this analogy because I would really like to have one. That is to say, a Maserati or Maserati. But don't think of the kind of Maserati that I'd love to have, which would be champagne gold with beautiful leather interior. Stick shift, of course. Think of a Formula One Maserati. Think of the beauty of the design and the power and strength of that vehicle. Think of the special tires. Think of the suspension. Think of the fuel injection system. Think of the pistons. Think of the transmission. Think of the steerage. Think of the total construction of a powerful vehicle such as a Formula One Maserati or Ferrari for racing. Now, I don't think I would be talking wildly or loosely if I said that that vehicle is powerful. That vehicle accelerates at a staggering speed. It handles on curves in an extraordinary manner, and it moves at very high velocity, dangerous velocity. Is a powerful vehicle, get this, no matter who's driving it. So obviously, if an accomplished race driver is at the wheel, that's someone who can handle the power of the vehicle and drive it safely if they don't lose control. But anyone else in the vehicle is going to have the power of that vehicle available to them. And if they're not skilled and trained in how to manage it, they're likely to create an enormous amount of damage. So, that's a narrative. That's what a narrative is. In fact, the narrative form is the most powerful vehicle ever created by the human species. We are a storytelling species. We navigate through life and through time and history using stories. Every day that you get up and you wake up, in the first 10 seconds that you are awake, you are constructing the story of your day. And every day, at the end of the day, before you go to sleep, you have registered in your memory the story, the narrative of the events of that day. And just imagine how you would function on any given day if you could not construct a narrative of your day. So two people can be walking down the street side by side, for instance, myself and someone else, and maybe we're walking down the same street. Maybe we even go into the same building. But we do so directed by totally different narratives. So you have day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year narratives that direct your life. But do you have a meta-narrative that directs your life? The characteristic of a meta-narrative is exactly identical to a mythogen. It defines identity and it defines purpose. Different species and races have their meta-narratives. Individuals, such as yourself and myself, may also have their meta-narratives, or they may not. One thing I can tell you with total confidence, and hold on, because you may or may not be relieved to hear this, but I can assure you that without a meta-narrative to direct your life, you will never be fulfilled as a human animal, a human being. In the introduction or orientation talk to the home story, I said, the transpersonal fulfills the personal. The personal cannot fulfill itself. I assure you, and you can take it for good news or bad news, either way, that you can never fulfill yourself unless you have a transpersonal perspective on your own life, unless you have a meta-narrative to follow. That is the great tragedy that often unfolds for many people. They don't find their purpose, or they find a personal purpose, and even if they succeed in achieving it, something's missing. And that is exactly what is missing in the lives of countless people on this planet. They do not have a meta-narrative, that is to say, technically speaking, a mythogen. But guess who does? Guess who does? Guess who has the most well-preserved, consistent mythogen on the entire planet? Well, that just happens to be the most hateful, devious, parasitical, and destructive people on the planet. And what makes them so powerful is the power of narrative itself, the power of the vehicle. You see, their narrative is a construct of lies and deception. But how can so many lies add up to such power and influence in the world? Well, there are two reasons for that, my friends. First reason is because the naive goyim do not expect to be deceived. Haven't you heard that line often quoted on the internet? It is easier to dupe people than to convince them that they have been duped. So there is something in the innocent and ingenuous nature of the goyim, the Gentiles, the races of the planet, that they are easily duped, and they don't expect to be treated in that deceptive and cruel way. And so when it happens, they're not prepared to handle it, and they may not even be able to detect how they are being duped. This is an enormous disadvantage, which in the current situation absolutely has to be overcome and overturned. So, in the first place, the power of the lie prevails simply due to the incapacity to detect that it is a lie, or even suspect that it is a lie. Look at what's happening today. Look around you. Talk to 10 people. How many of them suspect that the reportage coming through the mainstream media about the global pandemic is a lie? Well, thankfully, more and more do every day, exponentially. But you see what I'm getting at. And those who do not see the lie become accessory to the narrative that carries the lie. So there are untold numbers of tads, as I call them, people. There are untold numbers of them who are actually complicit in their own destruction because they do not detect the lies running in the narrative coming from those who seek to destroy them. It is the power of the narrative itself. It is the power of the Formula One Maserati, regardless of who's in the driver's seat. Now, the good side of that observation is, well, you know what I'm getting at. Can you imagine the power generated by unity in a meta-narrative that not only addresses the evil narrative from the Hebrew, the narrative of race supremacy and world domination? Can you imagine a meta-narrative that not only addresses and exposes it, as the Gnostics did, but has everything needed to overthrow it and defeat it? And there is a beautiful line, one of the few lines in the Nag Hammadi materials that could be considered to be prophetic. This line is found in a cosmological text called The Origin of the World. And there the Aeon Sophia herself addresses Yaldabaoth and the Archons. And she says, at the consummation of your works, that luminous child will arise and smash you as potter's clay is pounded. And it will destroy all your works, and they will be as if they had never been in the first place. Now that is one of the most beautiful, perhaps the most beautiful and powerful passages in the fallen goddess scenario. And I have quoted it often and taught it for many years. And there are many, many around the world who know it by heart. And even better, they know exactly what it means, and they know exactly how relevant it is to what's happening in the world right now. Enough said, and I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.